Now I'm going to give a little background analysis over the book Wasteland. Early in 1950 and 1920, it was a very difficult time for England due to the war that created an employment bill. Right after the war ended, the employment bill fell through and left over 2 million people unemployed in England. So this is what inspired Elias to write The Wasteland. For Elias, it was a way of communicating to the outside world what had resulted due to the war. Western Europe was one inspiration for many European artists, painters, musicians, poets, but right after the war, it was literally left in ruins, or as Elias called it, a wasteland, where over 10 million people were dead and buildings that were there for millenniums were all destroyed and gone. I'm going to give a background analysis over our author. His name is Elias. He was born on September 26, 1888 at Thomas Stern Elias in St. Louis, Missouri. Elias was the youngest of 7 children. Elias attended Smith Academy in St. Louis until he was 16. During his last year at Smith, Elias visited in 1904 St. Louis World Fair and was so taken with a native village that he wrote short stories about the primitive life for the Smith Academy writer. That's where his love for writing sparked. Later in 1905, he departed for a year at the Tom Academy outside of Boston. A year later, he enrolled at Harvard, where he received a BA in comparative literature and an MA in English literature. In 1914, he traveled to Germany for a seminar, where later in the fall, he enrolled into Oxford. There, in 1915, he married his wife, Vivian Haywood, which caused a family dispute among T.S. Eliot's family due to Vivian's background. Due to the war between 1914 and 1920 in Europe, Vivian did not want to travel to the States, therefore Eliot had no choice but to stay in London. Here in 1919, Eliot began to write The Wasteland, where 3 years later, Wasteland was published in 1922.
According to Merriam-Webster's definition, modernism is a style of art, architecture, and literature that uses ideas and methods which are very different from those used in the past. Modernism is a self-conscious break with the past and a search for new forms of expression. Quote, experimentation and individualism become virtues where in the past they were often heartily discouraged. The modernist movement was triggered by the cultural shock of the Great War, or World War I, which ended in 1918. The Wasteland was published in 1922, only 4 years after the war. The war made people unsure of what the future would involve. It, quote, in contrast to the romantic worldview, the modernist cares rather little for nature, being, or the overreaching structures of history, instead of progress and growth. The modernist sees decay and a growing alienation of the individual. T.S. Eliot's use of poetic skill and clever layering of meanings are a characteristic of the Wasteland as well as modernism in general. The idea of writing as a stream of consciousness, rather than writing about observations of the world, became more popular. As we learned in Professor Tucker's lecture, this stream of consciousness is more like a real conversation, which makes it harder to read, but there is also the potential to find a deeper meaning. Modernism represents the dramatic and conscious shift from the past in the style of works written in the early 20th century.
And now, for The Wasteland. We'll dive right into the first poem of the 5, The Burial of the Dead. This title, we know thanks to the notes, is a title given to the burial service in the Anglican Book of the Common Prayer. So with this in mind, we begin to look into the 4 sections that make up this particular part of the poem. Each section seems to have nothing in common with the one preceding it and the one following it. We can assume that there are 4 different authors for these sections. The second poem, A Game of Chess, is an allusion to the play by Thomas Middleton, with the same title, which allegorizes the English conflict with Spain as a chess match. The first part of this poem is in blank verse and tells the tale of a high-class woman driven crazy, awaiting her lover. The second section transports us into a London bar where two women are discussing how one of the women could lose her husband if she does not keep up appearances. The third poem, The Fire Sermon, and the longest and arguably most difficult to follow, has the same title as a sermon given by Buddha, where he hopes to persuade his followers to give up the pursuits of earthly goods. In this poem, we see a connection between the three previous poems, Mr. Eugenides, the husband of Miss Eugenides, mentioned in The Burial of the Dead. The poem is ended with a few lines from St. Augustine's Confessions. The fourth poem, Death by Water, is the shortest of the five-part poem and describes a man named Phlebas who dies from drowning and whose body is picked apart by the tides in ocean life. The fifth and final portion of the poem, What the Thunder Said, begins with a very modernist and existentialist thought that God is dead. Elias writes, "He who was living is now dead, and we who are living are now dying." This quote states that we have no savior, and that the world we live in now has no chance for an afterlife. The poem ends with the Shanti mantras, or the peace mantras, that are the Hindu prayers for peace used to ease the mind of the reciter and of the environment around her. It is a sign of ultimate resignation. There is no way to connect all of these sections of the wasteland, and it's through this lack of connection that we can see what actually binds them together. The modernist movement was a coming to terms with the reality of the New World after the destruction and desolation caused by World War I. The sections of these poems, and even the poems themselves, could all connect in a perfect world, but the fragmented and recently shattered world that T.S. Eliot lived in made it impossible for an accurate depiction of life to be a fluid and flowing thing. The poem is a cluster of pieces that could have connected somehow, but have been smashed and fragmented by the post-World War I society into ways that these connections cannot be seen anymore. Each section of the poem contains ordinary people doing ordinary things, and yet feeling desperately alone and lost doing them. These characters are dealing with how to cope with the news of the earth-shattering change that nothing is what they thought it was. All of these sections of the poem and their segments are filled with people looking and frantically searching for something, anything, and only finding death and despair as an answer all around them. Each poem is a desolate and empty shell of an answer to the pressing question each character wants to ask but does not know how. The question, who are we anymore? The different sections of the poem are harshly interrupted with lines and phrases in different languages, which only adds to the feeling of desperate confusion T.S. Eliot is trying to convey. The characters of the poem can no longer expect anything to be what it used to, due to the broken world they have been catapulted into. T.S. Eliot truly captures the wasteland that slowly sucked any semblance of happiness and perception of reality out of the life that was the world before World War I.